The following program was produced by the Warren, New Hampshire Historical Society through the facilities of New Hampshire Public Television. Funds for this program came from the John Merrill Olin Foundation and the New Hampshire Humanities Council. The Baker River flows down the side of Mount Moosilauke, here on the western edge of New Hampshire's White Mountains. It's said that these are the headwaters of the great Merrimack River. In a day or two, this water will be in the sea, to evaporate and rain again. The great cycle. This hillside was once completely logged off. 100 years ago, there were pastures here. 100 years ago, there were homes here, and people and music and work, before the trees came back. This is the story of a man and a family who lived here, near the Baker River, 100 years ago. A family that farmed, and a family that each summer took in lodgers, back in the time of the steam railroad. The farm that was here on the shoulder of Mount Moosilauke was called Merrill's Mountain Home. And the man was Amos Merrill. Amos Merrill.
He taught me to play cards. He taught me to waltz. He was a self-taught country fiddler. He had a violin that was bought, but when I was too little to reach a three-quarter size violin, he made me my first violin.
Marjorie Davis is Amos Merrill's granddaughter. Marjorie was born in 1904, and she is the only person alive who can remember Amos Merrill.
And he played his fiddle for the square dancing, because at night, I don't know whether they did it more than once a week or whether it was several times a week, the boarders would help push all the tables back in the big dining room, which had a hardwood floor. And then Grandpa played the violin and made the calls for the square dancing. And my mother played the piano, and her twin sister Fanny played the violin.
Amos Merrill was an exceptional man. Everyone said so. He was honest as old Abe, and likable, and extremely competent. Farmer, hunter, carpenter, craftsman, musician, innkeeper.
He is the most fascinating individual about all the people I've learned about on this project, because he stayed behind. We got lots and lots, we know lots about those people who left. We know in the early 20th century, according to the media, the only people who stayed behind were incompetent, unmarried, senile, driveling fools. That's the image of your hill country New Englander. But we know there's somebody called Amos Little Merrill that is there, who is none of those things. He's handsome, not formally educated, but skilled, articulate, imaginative, and he's created a world for himself. Well, he's taken advantage of opportunities that his family provided. There's every reason for him to have split, but he didn't. Now, I think part of it has to do with Mary. He appears in every way to have been a very functional, very solid, very relationship based on love and mutual respect and hard work.
Mary Elizabeth Olin came from Bennington, Vermont. This is Mary Elizabeth with her two sisters. She's the one in the middle. Mary Elizabeth was also the sister of the great American industrialist Franklin Olin, who was later to found the Olin Corporation. Mary Elizabeth Olin and Amos Merrill married in 1875, and the couple came to Warren, New Hampshire, to live on the family farm. Now, the town of Warren, New Hampshire, in 1875 looked much as it does today. But in some ways, Warren was more active in 1875 than it is today. For in 1875, the railroad was here, had been here for 25 years. Warren was a stop on the Boston, Concord, and Montreal line. This from the Warren town history about the day that the railroad arrived.
May 25th, 1851 was a great day for Warren. With that day came new life. The great teams and covered wagons, the pungs of winter, the stages, the mighty droves of beef cattle tramping along the road, the flocks of sheep, herds of swine going to market, all these shall now disappear from the highways of Warren forever. In their place shall come thundering cars, the iron horse with ribs of steel and heart of fire screaming with its steam whistle. On the first Monday in June, the cars began to run from Warren, no longer a quiet, pleasant hamlet, but now a smart, bustling little town among the mountains.
William Little, Warren Town Historian, 1870. Amos Merrill and his new bride, Mary, arrived at the Merrill farm in the spring of 1875. Amos's father, Nathaniel, was then 69 years old, and his mother, Judith, 65. Amos was 26, and the youngest son, which traditionally was important.
Often, the carrier of the family tradition was the youngest, not the oldest son. It was the youngest son. And it was done primarily because if you had an area which the old man developed, and he had a kid who was born when he was 25, and the kid's now gotten to be 20 years old, and he's, those days, 20 years old, you were out on your own. The old man's only 45 years old. That's too early. It's the youngest son who, just by the fact of timing, was most frequently in the position to work out a bargain with the father. Okay, I'm winding down now. You take over the property. So Amos fits into that much broader pattern of inheritability of property.
The fact was that Amos and Mary would have the property sooner than either would wish for Nathaniel was to live only 2 more years. But for now, the youngest son of Nathaniel and Judith Merrill had arrived with his bride at Merrill's mountain home. It had not been an easy life for Amos Merrill's parents. Judith and Nathaniel had had 8 children in all, and 4 of them, fully half, would die before their 23rd birthday. Amos, in fact, was given the name of a brother who died at age 3 of infectious disease. Another brother, James, died 4 years before, also at age 3, and a sister, Jane, died at 22, and another sister, Susan, died at 12. For Merrill's mountain home was truly on the fringes of civilization. The farm was 1,700 feet up on the shoulder of Mount Moosilauke, the last habitation before the summit, a lone light in the night. For some, a God-forsaken place, but for Amos and his father, Nathaniel, it was the only place to be.
And that's a kind of almost a declaration of a little bit of independence, you know? Not being down in the village, being up there, especially for the time it began, and then staying there. You know, staying there is and I see as the really strong individual in that process as Nathaniel. Nathaniel really built that, you know, some shifting of property lines, but he is the one that bought land to build up a large enough land so he can make a go of it as a farm.
It was Nathaniel Merrill and his wife Judith who first took in guests at Merrill's mountain home. It was Nathaniel, with the help of his son Amos, who with other townspeople helped create the carriage road up to the summit of Mount Moosilauke, the carriage road that began at Merrill's mountain home. Now, it's true Merrill's mountain home was the last farm on the mountain, and that meant that it was the most difficult to farm. But it is also true that being the last farm on the mountain made it the most attractive place for summer guests. And starting the summer of 1851, hundreds of summer guests arrived in Warren on the railroad.
It was Nathaniel's, in a sense, good luck and perhaps vision that when he knew that the railroads were coming, he saw an opportunity to continue what he wanted to do very much personally, which was to maintain a hill farm, and he could see that by supplementing it through the tourists and others that were coming.
It's hard to imagine summertime in a city like Boston back before air conditioning. The cobbled streets absorbed the heat like a skillet. And this was a time when even in the summertime men wore coats and women full-length skirts. Now the White Mountains were 20 degrees cooler and only a day's ride away on the new railroad.
Just for access to the White Mountains, I don't think Moosilauke was as visible as of course, Washington was. But once the railroad was designed to go by there through Warren, then Moosilauke took on another commercial importance. And the timing of what happened on the mountain and having to do with the Merrill Mountain Farm was very much a product of that.
And so each summer, thousands of people migrated to the mountains. Those who could afford it stayed at the great hotels that were being built all over the region. And a lot of people could afford it. It was a lot of money back before the income tax, and the grand hotels did very well. And there was a luxurious hotel right within sight of Merrill's mountain home, just down the road, on land that in fact once belonged to the Merrill family. The Breezy Point House. $3 a day. Very fancy. But along with the very rich, there was also a class of people who were educated and cultured, but who were not rich. Clergymen and schoolteachers fell into this category. Not rich, but respectable, and not employed in the summertime. These were the guests at Merrill's mountain home, at $1 a day. Guests would arrive at the Warren station to be greeted by a wagon and 4 horses, and driven up the mountain to the last farm on the road. There, to be welcomed not just as a guest, but as a member of the family. They were not arriving at the mountain inn or the mountain house nor the mountain view. They were coming to Merrill's mountain home, to become, for a month or so, part of a simpler life, to play at farming, to explore, to fish. Now, even at the close of his life, Amos's father, Nathaniel, would not slow down. In his last years, he engineered a moat to divert the brook to a trout pond, and he dug the moat himself. And during these years, he and Amos added a 3rd story with dormers to Merrill's mountain home. But then, in 1878, in the middle of the summer, Nathaniel Merrill suffered a heart attack and died. An agreement was drawn up between Amos and his mother. Amos would inherit the farm, but his mother would live there for the rest of her life. And so it was. And that summer, the summer that Nathaniel died, the guests at Merrill's mountain home went down to the meadow, and there they built a gazebo, a place for plays and charades and tableaux and music, and they called the playhouse Winnikenny. And 1 year later, in July, just 3 days before the anniversary of Nathaniel's death, Mary Elizabeth Olin Merrill gave birth to twin girls, Fanny and Lena. Fanny and Lena were not identical twins, and in fact they had quite different personalities. Fanny was studious and ladylike. Lena was the tomboy. Fanny was domestic. Lena, adventurous. Merrill's mountain home was the perfect place for both to grow up, for there was lots to do.
Mary, I think, must have had a very hard life with the keeping of a house that had 35 boarders, 3 meals a day, and all the preparation of the food coming in from the gardens. Because Grandpa had tremendous gardens, not only for the family and for canning, as people did in those days. They prepared a lot of the food for the winter. But to have 35 guests, when you think of the amount of peas to shell or corn to husk.
And there were adventures, too, places to explore, things to see, and of course, the mountain. For Merrill's mountain home was right there at the head of the carriage road up Mount Moosilauke. And there was a destination at the top of the mountain, the Prospect House. The Prospect House had been built back before the Civil War, and although it was a crude affair, it was shelter. And with the carriage road up the mountain and the building at the top, this was just the attraction needed to make Warren a prime destination. And of course, Merrill's mountain home was positioned perfectly. And in 1880, 20 years after the Summit House was built, it was expanded and renamed. It was now called the Tip Top House. A couple years after the Tip Top House was built, the Breezy Point Inn, that fancy hotel next to Merrill's mountain home, burned to the ground, only to be replaced by a larger and fancier hotel, the Moosilauke Inn. In 1893, the Great Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair, opened in Chicago, Illinois. And that same summer, 1893, a baby arrived at Merrill's mountain home from Illinois. The baby was John Olin, the son of Franklin Olin. Franklin, you may remember, was Mary Elizabeth Merrill's brother. The child arrived accompanied by his maternal grandmother, Grandmother Moulton. He was 1 year old. The twins, Lena and Fanny, were then 14 years old. No other children had been born to Amos and Mary Elizabeth, and in fact, no more children would be born to them. Franklin Olin had sent his son to the Merrill farm because of his great respect for Amos. He knew that Amos would teach the child hard work and Yankee values. And until he became a teenager, John Olin came each summer to Merrill's mountain home, to live with the family, to work on the farm, to be in the country.
It was very common feeling among New Englanders who had left the region for essentially practical reasons to go where there was better dirt, better soil, and continue their farming, to feel that they had left something more morally good for something that was more questionable. So you'd go back to New England, basically, to get that kind of moral training. The Horatio Alger novels that were coming up at that time. Those Horatio Alger novels, you always got your moral training from the countryside, and then you went in the cities where you made your megabucks.
The twins were growing up, becoming young ladies. When they turned 16, Amos and Mary enrolled them at Brewster Academy at Wolfboro, New Hampshire.
And I found a clipping somewhere, my house is full of clippings, describing Brewster. This was a free board and room and schooling. The bequest of somebody named Brewster, who realized that a lot of country, rural youngsters were not going to get the equivalent of a high school education. It was a boarding school, and my mother had a wonderful time because she was an outdoor girl, and among the other pranks that she pulled, she wasn't supposed to go ice boating on Winnipesaukee, but she loved it. And at some point, the ice boat went through some thin ice, and Mother was soaked, but she survived and climbed in through a window to get back to her room. Do you suppose any of that is inheritable?
Marjorie's mother was the adventurous twin, Lena Merrill. And her father was Leroy Smith. Now, Roy Smith was a man from Vermont who had come to Warren and at the time was working at Eastman's store. The building that housed Eastman's store is still there.
And there's a picture of Daddy sitting as if he owned the store. At what point he thought it would be fun to see whether he could work for Amos Merrill. I sometimes imagine that he saw those two pretty twins of Amos. And that could be, but anyway, he got a job because he was a very skilled farm boy. He knew how to hitch up and drive a four-horse team. And one of his chores was driving the four-horse team to the top of Mount Moosilauke, taking the guests. One of the pictures that I brought down shows Daddy coming down with a lot of snow. And the four-horse team, they're coming toward the camera.
Roy Smith was smart and talented and hard-working and handsome. Now, as you can see, the twins were very attractive. Roy Smith was especially taken with Lena. On May 1st, 1901, the 5th month of the brand new century, Lena Merrill and Roy Smith were married. One year later, their first child, Dorothy, was born at Merrill's mountain home. 2 years after Dorothy arrived, Marjorie was born.
As most babies in those days were born at home. And I guess when I was going to be born on the 18th of July, they thought, well, that might distress the guests. So Mother was banished to Warren, and I was born in Kate Weeks' house, which is right, you were almost facing that house from the little bandstand.
These were the happiest years of all, these years just before the First World War. Amos's twin daughters were grown, and he now had 2 granddaughters, whom he adored. And Lena Merrill Smith had taken up photography. Here we have a photograph of Lena with her camera. Most of the photographs in this story, in fact, were taken and developed by Lena Merrill Smith.
My mother, I'm wondering how she learned to do her own developing and printing. When you live 5 miles from the nearest village.
As time passed, that Merrill home, that Merrill farm, became less and less a part of a neighborhood and more isolated. As depopulation of the hillside came in, less a neighborhood, more a boarding house. Her relationships are more to the guests. How do you relate to the guests? You take pictures of them. That's got all these wonderful pictures, you see. What do you do if you're up there in winter? Well, that's, earlier you asked about what's the routine. Well, they're working most of the time, but they can't work all the time. So it's not difficult at all for me to imagine Marjorie's mother having done what she did because of that location.
Now it's true, Amos Merrill was a provincial. He was a countryman. But he had a certain glamour about him. And the greater world, the world outside of Warren, was finding out about Amos Merrill because, you see, over the years, many reporters came up from Boston to be guests at Merrill's mountain home. And a stay at Merrill's mountain home usually resulted in a story in the Boston papers. And that story always included the exploits of Amos as a bear hunter. This from the Boston Herald.
Suddenly, this big black bear jumped out from behind a large boulder several hundred feet away and started toward him. The bear had gone but a short distance when it spied Mr. Merrill and bounded toward the mountain in the opposite direction. One shot from the rifle struck, but no more than angered the animal, which turned about ready to fight. Reaching the spot where he could have a good range, and too close if the rifle should accidentally hang fire, Mr. Merrill took aim and sent another bullet, which also took effect, but made the bear more vicious. And as it wheeled about ready to pound, a third shot in a fatal spot brought the prize down. This bear, one of the largest ever captured in this vicinity, has the best coat of fur that Mr. Merrill has ever seen. The fur coat has been made into a rug, and the owner prizes it more than anything else he possesses.
The legend is that he got a bear every year for 40 years, and sometimes once he got 4, and occasionally he'd get 2, but for 40 years that was written up in the Boston papers about this great bear hunter.
I love the symbolism of the bear hunter. That's the wilderness. I mean, this is a caricature. You've got a bear hunter who takes in college professors for guests, you see. And the location is absolutely perfect because it's right on the edge of the woods, and that's where the bears come. And the railroad comes in, and it's right on the edge. The road kind of stops there. You have to go into the wilderness after that.
And as for John Olin had received from his Uncle Amos just what his father, Franklin Olin, had hoped. A view of how hard work and honesty pays off in this world. In his later years, he was to write,
Amos Merrill was a remarkable man. I recall his turning out a complete croquet set on his woodworking lathe, and we used them in playing croquet in a field which was down towards the pond. Also, he taught me to fish for trout, and I remember my first fly rod, for which I saved up money from the payments he used to make to me for chores I did. I had 4 cows to milk, morning and night, and I became an expert woodchuck trapper. I helped him with many of his chores around the place. I recall distinctly he did not permit me to become a harvester of raspberries in his garden, because he said this was a losing game, as I ate as many as I put into the bucket. My maternal grandmother was very much irritated with me, as I refused to eat with the summer guests, and my meals were all taken with the family in the dining room, which was near the woodshed. I really believe Uncle Amos treated me just as if I were his own son.
He could not imagine having learned more from a person than he did from Amos Merrill. He learned work habits. He learned, he ate the raspberries, and you can't work in my raspberry patch. No, it's not worth me. He bought his first fishing rod from money he got from, I think, milking cows. He got the kind of farm upbringing that we all wish our middle-class kids had had. They wouldn't have gotten into drugs and this kind of stuff. He got it right there, and he appreciated it.
To the day he died, John Olin credited his success in life and business to the example set for him by his Uncle Amos. And in fact, later in life, John Olin changed his middle name to Merrill in respect for Amos Merrill. John Moulton Olin became John Merrill Olin. Now, bear hunting was scary and dangerous. It was an activity that Amos did, he felt, out of necessity to keep his sheep safe. But most of the guests didn't participate in bear hunts. They did, however, fish. In the Baker River, well, it was not known for the size of its trout, but there were a lot of fish there. And it was a picturesque place to pose for photographs. Over the years, the original bridges over the stream had been replaced a number of times. And the last bridge that was there was this one. And this one was a second-hand bridge. It had been a trolley car bridge near Weir's Beach on Lake Winnipesaukee. It became part of the Merrill family legend when Roy Smith once climbed to the top to impress his wife-to-be. The bridge, like many of the other artifacts of the time, has long since disappeared. But the Baker River remains. The guests also played tennis, lolled out in hammocks, climbed the mountain, and participated in charades.
Now, I don't know what these two were acting out. I'm not sure whether this is a neighbor of the Merrills, but this is my father, all dressed up in women's clothes. The boarders used to decide they'll act out something perhaps from mythology or from history. They'd be down at Winnikenny, the little gazebo, and Mother with her camera would get the resultant tableau.
This is not casual dressing that they're doing. This is an important part of their middle-classness or their professionalness. There had to be some courtship that went on there. There had to be some courtship that I look at the pictures and I see an awful lot of people that are kind of glancing at each other this kind of way.
On August 27th, 1906, a terrible thunderstorm swept over Mount Moosilauke. Amos was milking a cow when the lightning struck. Marjorie, who was just 2 years old, was in the house. Her aunt, Fanny, was upstairs in the bedroom. Amos was knocked off the milking stool, and the cow was killed by the strike. The evidence of the scar on the barn and the house shows that the lightning split in two as it got to the ground. Fanny in the upstairs room was knocked unconscious. Her shoes were blown off her feet. Here's a picture of the shoes. The doctors felt sure that Fanny would not survive the strike. Here's a photo of the barn with the scars and a 2-year-old Marjorie in the doorway.
Auntie was closing one of the guest windows when the storm came up, but I was standing on the front porch, and I'm sure I could have been in danger. But Auntie was struck by lightning, and apparently the bolt struck her neck, and because women wore corset steels, had corset real steel round, so there'd be quite a few. And my guess is that the lightning may have been conducted faster down her corset steels and down her leg and burst her shoe open.
But Fanny did not die. In fact, a few days after the lightning strike, Fanny, looking a little punchy but nonetheless alive, posed with a group for this photograph. Fanny's the woman in the light dress, seated there on the left, leaning against the porch upright. The caption on this photo reads, "The gang that had fun after Fanny was struck by lightning." Not incidentally, Fanny lived until 1976, when she died at the age of 97. It was a sweet time, those first few years of the 20th century. The tip-top house was expanded again. You'd hardly recognize this elegant structure from its crude beginnings. Amos and Mary were prosperous. Merrill's mountain home was busy. At any one time, there were upwards of 36 guests. Lena and Roy were happy. The children, Dorothy and Marjorie, were a delight. And Fanny had a gentleman friend, Mendon Moore, who came from Manchester. But it was not to last. And in fact, there was beginning to be a feeling of unease at Merrill's mountain home. Mary Olin Merrill was ill. Mary, shown here on the porch in her white dress, Mary, who normally had the energy of two people, now no longer had the strength to do her job. Each season, Fanny had shouldered more and more of the work of running the house. And Dorothy, Amos's first grandchild. Dorothy was diagnosed to have diabetes, an incurable illness, in 1909. She would not live to adulthood. Things were coming apart. Over in Vermont, Leroy Smith's sister died. She died of the same disease his oldest daughter suffered from, diabetes. And the death gave Leroy's mother a nervous breakdown. So Roy and Lena and their daughters, Dorothy and Marjorie, moved to Vermont to be near Roy's mother. The next year, 1910, Amos sold Merrill's mountain home to the Pike family from Averill, New Hampshire. The Pikes wanted the land and the timber. They had little interest in the farm. But it wasn't quite over. The next year, Fanny's suitor, Mendon Moore from Manchester, rented Merrill's mountain home from the Pikes, and they had one last season. But it was not a success. Soon Amos and Mary went to join their daughter and son-in-law in Vermont, and it was there in Vermont that Mary died, July 19th, 1913. And the next year, Dorothy died.
Oh, Dottie was beautiful, just a beautiful child. I think the boarders and everybody who knew her in the time she was there just loved her. She was just a gorgeous little girl. And I don't know how soon the illness might have been discovered, but insulin hadn't been discovered before she died at 12. And they knew for quite a while that she was not going to live. The doctors, of course, let them know. And she actually died at Auntie's in Manchester, New Hampshire. We made frequent visits, at least a summer visit, sometimes a winter visit, to Mother's twins family. And she died down there.
The final chapter came in 1915. In the middle of the night, Merrill's mountain home burned to the ground. Nothing was saved. It had been 4 years since anyone had lived in the building. 5 years later, January 20th, 1920, Amos Merrill, farmer, innkeeper, carpenter, fiddler, fisherman, bear hunter, died in his sleep in Vermont. He was 71. And that's the story of Merrill's mountain home. As for the family, Fanny married Mendon Moore. They had 2 sons. Lena and Roy had 2 other children, both born in Vermont. Barbara, who was born the year they moved, and a son who was born in 1916. They named their son Arthur Merrill Olin Smith. His initials, AMOS. Arthur Merrill Olin Smith died in a bombing raid over Germany in World War II. He left a wife and 2 sons. Marjorie married an Army officer, Claire Conzelman, and moved to be with him at his station in the Philippines. The couple had 2 children. In World War II, Claire Conzelman became a prisoner of the Japanese at Corregidor. He died in a Japanese ship that was transporting prisoners to Japan. The ship was bombed by U.S. forces just at the end of the war. Marjorie is writing a book about Claire Conzelman and about the Philippines before and during World War II. Marjorie later remarried. Her second husband was Dean Davis, governor of Vermont. Davis died in 1990. John Olin went on to head Olin Industries, Squibb Pharmaceuticals, Winchester Firearms. In his later years, he became a noted philanthropist, dog breeder, and sportsman. He was even featured on the cover of Sports Illustrated. To the end, he credited much of his success in life to Uncle Amos and to Merrill's Mountain Home.
And now over 100 years have passed since Amos Merrill brought his bride to Merrill's Mountain Home, and the world is a different place. All of the pastures on the mountainside have disappeared, as have most of the farms. The land that was once Merrill's Mountain Home is now part of the White Mountain National Forest. And the railroad that brought people and prosperity to Warren and to Merrill's Mountain Home, the railroad, too, is gone, discontinued in 1954. The great cut that hundreds of laborers toiled to create to make passage through to Montreal today stands overgrown and abandoned. And of all the people who knew and loved Amos Merrill, only Marjorie remains. And on a summer day in 1994, she came back to Warren and to the spot where Merrill's Mountain Home once stood. There was almost nothing here to remind her of the place of her youth. The tennis courts, the croquet lawn, the Winnikenny gazebo, the barn, the house, all were gone. Even the Breezy Point Inn next door is gone. It burned in 1953. And the Tip-Top House on the summit, it too burned and was not replaced. And the bridge over the Baker River, it was torn down during World War II, used as scrap iron for the war effort. But the carriage road is still here, and some foundation stones, but you could walk within 10 feet of them and never notice. A remnant of the old well is here, and a couple of the maple trees planted during the Civil War to hang hammocks from. And the Baker River is still here. And of course, the mountain. But Merrill's Mountain Home only remains in the town history and in the mind of Marjorie Davis.
If you would like to order a copy of this program, please write Warren Historical Society, Post Office Box 114, Warren, New Hampshire, 03279. The following story was produced by New Hampshire Public Television. Plane crash site. This carved profile of Mount Moosilauke stands near the west entrance of the mill at Loon Mountain up in Lincoln, in New Hampshire's White Mountains. And up on the mountain itself, in an area 40 feet wide and 200 feet long, great pieces of an airplane are scattered through the trees like blown newspapers. And because it is aluminum, the weather has done very little to it. If you were to happen on the site by accident, you might think the crash occurred just yesterday, instead of over 50 years ago, in the dark of the night, in the dead of winter. It happened January 14th, 1942, to be precise, a snowy, overcast evening. About 7:40 that night, a large twin-engine bomber flew low over the town, headed straight for the mountain. The plane was an Army Air Corps Douglas B-18, a design called the Bolo bomber, and it carried a crew of 7 men. Minutes later, the airplane plowed into the mountainside. The plane was now on fire, and the 200-pound bombs the plane was carrying began exploding. It had been less than 6 weeks since the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and down in Lincoln, some of the citizens thought maybe the war was beginning right there in town. And in some ways, they were right. Because after that night, no one in Lincoln would ever again think of the war as something remote. Dr. Alan Handy certainly wouldn't.
My wife and I were playing bridge at the Lincoln Hotel, and we heard this terrific explosion, or I think there were 2, and saw a light up on Mount Moosilauke on the ridge called Waternomi. And somebody came in and said they thought a plane had crashed.
We had Sherman Adams involved, and he saw the fires up on Mount Waternomi, and that would be close to the Moosilauke Ravine Lodge. And he thought that that might be the site and that something had happened up there to the lodge. And being a Dartmouth man, he was very interested in tracking down the source of those flames. And he put through a call, I believe, to Hans Paskin, who was the general manager of the lodge. And eventually, what came out of all of it was the knowledge that this was happening in a nearby mountain. And Paskin, I think, felt it had to be in the Waternomi area, but it certainly wasn't the Moosilauke Ravine Lodge.
Who was Sherm Adams at that time? I realize he became governor.
He was
and chief of
the
staff
woods
later, but
boss at Parker Young Company.
he was the honcho for the Parker Young
Right.
Company that, well, let's be
Yep.
truthful about this, owned the town.
Yeah.
Paul Doverlock, one of the chief rescuers who went on to become a World War II hero, was in a house that bomber might have passed over that night.
Well, on that night I was visiting friends in Lost River, on Lost River Road, and we heard these explosions. So this Bob Kelly and myself, and we're going to find out what it was. We went home and threw on some little heavier clothes we had, because we were going out that evening, and we went up the Warren Road. When we reached there was a confusion of a lot of cars there and everything else, and a lot of the fellows, state police were there and the forestry were there, but nobody had moved. So a bunch of us got together and we said, we got to go up and see what's going on. This Neil McGinnis had a small compass. He took a reading on the fire from the road, and we followed it up through. We kept going. The snow was very deep, about 4 to 5 feet of snow, and we kept breaking trail. One would break for a while and he couldn't go any further, another one would step up.
A party had gone up looking to see if they could get to the plane. And I followed him up with a couple of other people, I can't remember who.
And after we got up there quite a ways, somebody, the lead man would holler, "Hello!" He'd keep hollering that. And finally, when we got to the top of the mountain, and that was hours later, we heard help. Well, I guess we froze that right then and there.
Survivors. After crashing into a mountainside and exploding bombs, survivors? Yeah, 3 survivors. There in the woods, bloody but walking. The airplane mechanic, the navigator, and the co-pilot, 24-year-old Lieutenant Woodrow Cantner. Lieutenant Cantner is now 75 years old.
I just about had hit the end of that I couldn't go any further. And then we heard some voices, and we start yelling help, I guess. And a search car party came along and tobogganed me down.
At the time of the plane crash, I was just under 21 years of age. I turned 21 6 days later.
In 1942, he was Army Air Corps Private Richard Chubb. Private Chubb was the airplane mechanic.
Started down the mountain and found that Lieutenant Cantner and Lieutenant Craig were with me. Because I'd be in days, I didn't realize that they were following me. And we started down, and just before we hit the cliff that they said was just ahead of us, we met the rescue party coming up to the mountain.
We found Cantner, Craig, and Chubb. So most of the fellows went down off the mountain with them. There was 3 of us left, and they said there was nobody left up there. The plane had bombed, the bombs had exploded. So we said, we're going up and see the plane. So Bob Kelly, myself, and Everett Kenny, when it was going towards the plane, we got within 300 yards of it, somewhere in that vicinity, and we heard help again. Well, we froze again. So we went over and found this Benvenuto, Lieutenant Benvenuto, laying in the snow. We found out later he had a broken back. And not more than a couple of 100 feet away, we heard another cry for help. So Bob Kelly and Everett Kenny stayed with Benvenuto, and I went to see this kid, Robert Pickard. His leg was wrapped around a tree, and he was having trouble, he was in pain. So I introduced myself. I told him I'm Paul Doverlock, and I said, I'm here to try to help you. So, and his leg, he was crying, not crying, but he was really in pain. So I said, let's try to straighten that leg out. It was wrapped right around the tree. So I never had any first aid before. So I said, good judgment. I said, you got one leg going one way and the other leg going, so if I pull it, straighten it out, which I did. I grabbed it and pulled it, and he let out a scream because he was hurting. He was really broken right off.
Now, what was an Army bomber doing in New Hampshire's White Mountains? Well, it turns out they were looking for submarines.
Benvenuto and Chubb were permanent supplement at Westover Field, Springfield. And that's where the bombing mission for anti-sub started out. The problem with our mission was that we had a complete change of wind, and we were 10 hours out over water, flying over Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. And when we hit the coast coming back, where we hit this squall, and we thought we were on course, and we went into this heavy turbulence, and I think our altitude, if I remember correctly, was somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 foot. And we broke out one time, and we thought it was Provincetown. But we realized after the accident it was Concord, and we were 125 miles off course and didn't know it.
Lieutenant Cantner turned on the landing gear lights. We were going through a thick snowstorm, and he just put on these lights for a moment and happened to see the tree coming. And that was the only notice that he had.
All of a sudden I thought it was clouds, and I realized it was snow on a mountain. And then I grabbed the controls and kicked just reflex action in a matter of, I'd say, seconds. and then all you could hear was a crash. But we realized that we actually made a landing on top of the trees, and the way the airplane was built, it absorbed a lot of the shock, because as a result, there were 2 that died in the airplane, and then I think out of a crew of 7, there were 4 of us in pretty bad shape.
Lieutenant Katner had a broken ankle, broken wrist, and Lieutenant Benvenuto had a broken back, and Sergeant Pickard, PFC Pickard, had a busted hip. He was the photographer and gunner in the rear ship.
Dovalock had straightened out Pickard's leg. There wasn't much more to do. I think I used a limb and made a splint. And the main thing was to keep them warm and wait for other help. And various groups had been alerted, and about 2 a.m., as I remember, Sherm Adams arrived up a trail that had been cut out by the woodsman with toboggans.
The 5 airmen were hospitalized at the Lincoln Infirmary early the next morning. Later in the day, all but PFC Pickard were taken to the military hospital at Grenier Field in Manchester. Pickard's condition was deemed too unstable for him to be moved at that time.
And Sunday morning, I got a phone call from Ina McMinn, who was a nurse at the hospital, that Bob Pickard wanted to see me. So I went up. I was down at my mother's house, and I went up there, and I visited with him. His leg was packed in ice, which they had then. They didn't have any of this refrigeration like they got now. So I talked to him for a while, and he said to me, he said, I understand you're going to service. I said, yeah, I'm leaving tomorrow morning. He said, what are you going into? I said, the parachute troops. He said, you're crazy. He said, that's suicide.
And a side note here. The crash, odd as it may seem, may in fact have saved Lieutenant Kampner's life. For had he made it back to Westover Field that night, he was scheduled to fly to California the next day on a plane that crashed in Arizona, killing all aboard. It was, in fact, the same plane that the movie star Carol Lombard lost her life in. Well, 50 years had passed, and in the summer of 1992, the town of Lincoln held a reunion of the people who were there that night, the night the bomber crashed. There were speeches and displays and food, and a citation from President Bush was read. And there were lots of stories. As for the crew, well, the pilot, Lieutenant Anthony Benvenuto, was killed in World War II when his B-24 bomber was shot down in Asia. After the war, Lieutenant Craig became a dentist in San Francisco. He died a few years ago. Lieutenant Kantner is now a successful real estate developer in Florida. Private Chubb is now retired. He lives in Bedford, Massachusetts. PFC Robert Pickard is also alive, but declined to come to the reunion. As for Paul Dovalock, he joined the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles. He got many decorations for his service in World War II. He went into private, came out a captain. And he carries a wound he received in the Battle of the Bulge, almost lost a hand. He is a real hero. Paul Dovalock now lives in Littleton.
If the bombs hadn't exploded, we'd have never known they were there, I think, for a long time, and they would have died. And they were in pain and shock. And I remember Dovalock, who was a young fella, spoke to them with sympathy and kept their courage up through the night. He came from a family I knew well, and They were that kind of people. In fact, Lincoln people were that kind of people.